Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do something that has become a bit of an annual tradition. It's a video where I take a little time at the end of the year to talk about books that I read and really enjoyed during the calendar year and which not a lot of other people have talked about or which I think deserve more attention. It's my way of trying to generate a little extra conversation for some of these books. Maybe if you are interested, you will read them, hopefully love them, and put them in the hands of more people, because to me, these are books that really deserve to be discovered or read more widely. Some of these are, significantly less obscure than the others, but I just think they deserve a lot more awareness and praise than they are getting. That's the general idea. I'll have links to the previous years in which I have done this in the description box down below if you would like to go on a journey and check out some of the previous incarnations of this that I have done. I believe this is now the 4th year that I have done this video, which is kind of wild. What is time? I will also have links to each of the titles I discuss on bookshop.org in the description box down below. These are affiliate links, so if you're interested in the book and want to think about purchasing them that way, that's great. Otherwise, I would encourage you to support your local independent bookstore, go to your library, or anything like that. I just think any way you can get these books in your hand, hopefully you would enjoy them as much as I did. So I have a couple of books to talk about. Let's jump right in with the first one, which is Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. I read this book really early on in 2023, and it has held on to remain one of my favorite reads of the year. It was published in 1917, I believe, and it is every bit as urgent and relevant and resonant today as it was when it was originally published. And that's because history can be a little bit cyclical, and that is something that I find a little comforting. I don't know if you do as well, but about 100 years ago, the Industrial Revolution had really significantly changed capitalism and the workforce, and we are currently kind of undergoing a similar thing with the movement to digital platforms and things like that. So the protagonist of the book, whose name is obviously Fanny, and by the way, I should mention, if you live in the UK, I know that's a funny name for the book and the character. There's nothing I can do about that. But anyway, so it actually begins with her mother, and her mother runs a shop with her husband. The husband dies, and she takes over, and she actually makes the store a success. And she builds this really big customer base based on running a business well, first of all, but also really catering to what her customers want and understanding what they need, and building a sense of community around her store. But there are pressures from the outside that are making it difficult for her. But at that time, catalogs were the thing. People are getting these catalogs. They can order through the mail. It's significantly cheap, but it is missing a lot of those community aspects. It's not giving anything back to the community. It doesn't have any of the services that the store can provide. Is this sounding familiar? But like I said, this is a book that was published 100 years ago, and it feels like it could have been written now easily. And then Fanny comes up and grows up, and she goes on a journey where she loses herself and finds herself in this capitalistic structure. And it's about her trying to find out what is really important in her life and what kind of a life does she want to live. It is a beautiful book. It is a funny book. I have gone on a bender purchasing Edna Ferber books ever since. I haven't read any of the other ones yet. She is a Pulitzer Prize winner, so I will get to her as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. But I absolutely loved this book, and I have a whole collection of her books actually right up here on my shelves, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of her books. I enjoyed Fanny Herself that much that I am so impressed by how timeless she managed to make this book. And I really just hope that it starts to find its way into more hands, because it feels like something that could have been published now. It is just as resonant for someone to read now as it was back then. The next one is something I actually have in my hands, Loved and Missed by Susie Boit. This is a somber book in some ways, but it is also a bit of a hopeful book because it's ultimately about the power of love. This is published by New York Review of Books. It came out this year. And I believe Susie Boit is an Irish writer who hadn't been published in the United States before. I could be wrong about that part. but I believe this is at least one of her first, if not the first, books to make it across the pond. And I hope that they continue to send more over, because this is just a fantastic book. So in this book, you have a mother who really loves her daughter and has tried very hard to foster a loving and healthy relationship, but dissatisfaction with her daughter, compounded by addiction, has created this heavy friction between them. And she keeps trying to reach out, and it just never goes well every time she tries to make a connection between them and to try to improve the situation. Her intentions are always warped in her daughter's mind, and it ends up going very badly. The daughter gets pregnant, and in a twist of circumstances, because she can see that the baby is not being cared for, our protagonist, whose name is Ruth — I had to look at the back of the book to remind myself of that — Ruth takes the granddaughter and sort of convinces her daughter to let her take the granddaughter and raise her. And it's about Ruth, the power of Ruth's love for her daughter, and the hope that things will be fixed with her daughter, that sort of boundless, endless optimism that she has, that there will be some way of mending her relationship with her daughter, but also mending her daughter's relationship with her granddaughter, because she really wants her daughter to have a healthy relationship. And she, in some ways, feels that she's getting a second chance with her granddaughter, because she can rectify whatever mistake she made — she doesn't even know what it is — with her own daughter. But also she feels that she can step in and protect her own daughter's relationship with the granddaughter, because she doesn't want her daughter to get to the point where she will just never be able to have a healthy relationship with her daughter. And there's something really beautiful about that, something that I just really profoundly appreciate. I do love a book about a complicated family. This definitely fits that bill. And it is something that I think a lot of people would benefit from and would also really enjoy. I think the sort of unending love that Ruth has for her daughter and for her granddaughter is really powerful. It is ultimately hopeful. It is sad as well. It's just a really beautiful story about Ruth and what she tries to achieve, and the sort of ripple effects that kindness and love can have in the world, which of course I found absolutely, absolutely beautiful in the end, and I hope you would as well. Then we get to a very slim book, Address Unknown, by Catherine Cressman Taylor. This was originally published in a magazine around 1932 or 1933, maybe a little later in the 1930s. I could be wrong about that. But it was published in a magazine, and I think it has sort of faded into obscurity. There are definitely people who have known it. Everyone I know who has read this has commented on how powerful it is, even though it is also incredibly, incredibly short. And remember, it was originally published in a magazine. And this page count includes a forward and an afterword. There's an introduction, and then there is the book, which is epistolary as well, so it's really easy to read. You could read this in like an hour or 2 hours, depending on how fast you read. However, it will stay with you long after you turn the last page. The premise of it is that you have these two people who had been friends and coworkers in the United States. One of them moves back to Germany in the 1930s, and they send letters back and forth, and almost immediately the tone of the letters starts to get very tense and difficult, and awful things start to happen, because, think about what was happening in Germany in the 1930s. And it's about how you can be warped by political messaging, and it's a very powerful book, despite how short it is. It is devastating, and one of its historical significances is that it sort of put the truth to the lie that people in the United States didn't really have any way of knowing what was going on in Germany in the lead up to World War II. There were definitely ways people could have known that there was a very bad situation developing if they had paid attention. And again, this is something that you could easily fit in or slip onto your bookshelf. So I would highly recommend it. I listened to it on audio. The audio had the introduction and the afterword, which I think are definitely helpful because it helps you place the book in the time and the context in which it was originally published, and that helps you appreciate how revolutionary and revelatory it is for all that. So that is Address Unknown, a novella by Catherine Cressman Taylor. And that takes us to Wandering Souls by Cecily Pinn. Now, I know what you're about to say. Greg, how could this be an unknown book? It was longlisted for the Women's Prize. Well, yes, but it didn't make the shortlist for the Women's Prize. And I think there was a bit of an outcry when it didn't make the shortlist about how this book would have been extremely worthy of making the list. I read it in July, so after the Women's Prize had already been awarded. And yes, it, in my opinion, absolutely should have made the shortlist. And it deserves to be on more people's year-end best lists because this is just a fantastic book. It is about siblings who are refugees during the Vietnam War. They end up in London, which is not where they were intended to go. They had to travel separately from their parents and their other siblings in order to get out of the country. And unfortunately, their parents and the other siblings did not make it. So you have these three siblings who end up orphaned, and they are so young that they don't know how to navigate the world. The oldest child, who is a sister, has to essentially give up the rest of her childhood to try to help her brothers through whatever is going to happen to them and try to navigate the world so that they end up on sure footing. It is very powerful as someone who grew up with an older sister who stepped into a motherly role when our mother was not in a place where she could really fill it. You know, it made me think a lot about my sister and the sacrifices that she made in her childhood in order to make sure that my sister and I, my other sister and I, had a good life and were set up for success in life. And it made me think of the ways I resented her for doing that as a child and would throw things in her face like, you're not my mom. And yeah, it's a very powerful book. It definitely resonated with me, even though I have never been a refugee from Vietnam. And I think it's really beautiful and powerful. And I wish this book had appeared in more places, like more book awards, like the Booker, anything like that. This is a book that deserves a lot more recognition this year, and I'm hoping that by featuring it in this video, maybe we can begin the process of rectifying that. And then I want to talk about another book that was on the Women's Prize long list, The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. This immediately jumped out to me from the Women's Prize long list as something that I wanted to read. I didn't get around to it until a little bit later in the year after it had already not made the shortlist. And this is a very funny book in a lot of ways. And it feels like it actually has no right to be anywhere near as funny as it is, because this is a book about women in India who are experiencing abuse and who are struggling in this patriarchal system in which they live to find their own agency and get some control over their lives. And so basically you have your protagonist whose abusive husband disappeared one day, just left. And people in the town assume that she murdered her husband. She didn't, but the fact that they think that she murdered her husband starts to afford her a degree of autonomy. People are a little bit afraid of her. They don't want to cross her. So she is able to start her own business and make her own way in the world for the first time, despite the fact that she is a woman and women are not supposed to stick to this very defined role within society. And she is now able to get out of that. So she sort of plays along and doesn't say anything either way, but she does kind of encourage for people to think that she did murder her husband. One day, another woman in town who is being abused by her husband comes to her and says, look, I know you murdered your husband. Help me get rid of my husband. And of course she says no. The woman blackmails her. This is all early on in the book, so we're not into spoiler territory. And then from there, chaos sort of ensues because more women get involved. So essentially, this is a book about women who have been abused, women who are being denied rights, and it's a book about women potentially murdering their husbands. And yet, it is so funny and entertaining, and it feels like a book about abuse shouldn't be this funny. And yet the fact that it is makes it so much more powerful, and it has a lot of really smart observations about class. It sort of gets into the caste society and the notion of creating others and people for you to stand on top of in society. It doesn't just look at the difference between men and women. It looks about the differences that people create at all levels. And it is very entertaining. It is very poignant. It feels so weird to say this, but I can't think of another book that I got as much enjoyment out of reading this year. And again, doesn't feel like this should be that book because has such a serious subject matter, but it's handled in such a way that it has all of that resonance while being funny and entertaining. And I am so in awe of Perini Schroff for managing to walk that line. I don't know anyone else who could do that, especially a debut author. So I am really profoundly impressed by what she did with The Bandit Queens, and I can't wait to see what she does next. Moving along, we get to Dearborn by Ghassan Zenedine. This is a book that I found really interesting, and it's a story collection, and funny and resonant in a lot of ways, and it feels like it had a very muted release earlier this year, and I don't really know anyone else who has read this. So this is me putting this in front of you and saying, you know what? This probably wouldn't land in your top 5 for 2023. It could easily be crowded out of that. However, it is a very interesting and powerful read. So the stories are kind of interconnected as you go throughout, but not in the way of, say, Night of the Living Rez, where they all follow the same essential story. These are just people within the same community. So if one character in one story owns a store, that store may be mentioned. Or if the character in the opening story is an actor, he might be mentioned somewhere down the line. And these are funny stories. Like one of them is about a man who shows up at a community pool wearing a Speedo, and it's about the different reactions that the wives have and the husbands have to him, and ways they portray him differently. Like the husbands might say, well, he doesn't have the body to wear that Speedo. And then the women are like, wow, he is really fit. And that's really interesting. And the title is The Town of Dearborn in Michigan, which has a really interesting history. I happened to learn about this book after I saw an episode of Padma Lakshmi's Taste the Nation, where she went to Dearborn, Michigan, and talked about the Middle Eastern community that developed there, because Henry Ford didn't want to hire too many Black people or Jewish people to work in his plants, so they started bringing people over from the Middle East. And today you still have this large Middle Eastern population outside of Milwaukee. And it's about immigration, it's about displacement, it's about settling in and finding your own community, and it's about religion. Lots of levels of interesting conversations are to be found in the book Dearborn, which is a debut. And I had a really good time reading this book. I got a lot out of it, and I hope that more people will discover it and hopefully get more, as much as I did, out of it, and give it a lot more life in the future. Next, we have Only This Beautiful Moment by Abdi Nazemian, which, to be fair, had a bit of a splash when it was originally published, but then I haven't really heard anything about it since, and I really am hoping to bring Abdi Nazemian to more people, because this is the second book of his that I have read, and it's the second book of his that has absolutely knocked it out of the park and just been amazing on multiple levels. The first one was Like a Love Story, which I might have featured in this video in the year that I read it. It was definitely in my favorite books of that year, and Only This Beautiful Moment will be among my favorite books for this year. So this is the story of 3 generations of Iranian men in a family. And in the opening of the book, the grandfather is dying, so the son and the grandson go to Iran to be with him, and the grandson has conflicted feelings about this because he is gay. And he has conflicted feelings about going to a country where being gay is criminalized. And then his perceptions when he gets there are very upended. And he realizes that he had been judging a country. And it's about, in many ways, life finding a way. Because you go back in time and you can see ways that gay people had lived criminalized in the United States. And it goes back and forth between Iran. So the grandfather had been sent to the United States to live with his grandmother, kind of dabbled in Hollywood, and then eventually ended up back in Iran, where the father was born, and then the father was sent to the United States during the Iranian Revolution, and that is where he raised his son, and now they have returned to Iran to be with the grandfather upon his death. The stories of all of their lives and how they shifted and how they ended up going back and forth are beautiful tapestries, and they sort of mirror each other in really interesting ways. The sort of complex structure is handled with ease by Abdi Nazemian, and he just made this really interesting, powerful story about generations of men, the differences, the misunderstandings, and the connection between them, and the love that they have for each other and their family and their communities and their heritage, and how they come to be empowered as who they are. I think it's a really beautiful story, and I hope more people will read it and discover the work of Abdi Nazemian in the future. Which takes us to Whose Names Are Unknown by Sonora Babb. I've mentioned this a lot because I am definitely trying to bring more attention to Sonora Babb. She wrote Whose Names Are Unknown in the 1930s when she was working for the government in labor camps where migrant workers from the Dust Bowl had ended up in California. And she was interviewing a lot of the people who had come over from Oklahoma about their circumstances and the difficulties that they faced and the discrimination that they faced from Californians who didn't want people coming into their land. And she was taking very heavy, detailed notes about the conversations that she had with them and the experiences that they had had. She herself had been born in Oklahoma and come to California, so a bit of her own experience was in there as well. Those notes were handed over to her supervisor. Unbeknownst to her, her supervisor gave those notes to John Steinbeck, and he used them to at least some degree in crafting The Grapes of Wrath. So she had a book deal to publish Whose Names Are Unknown, but The Grapes of Wrath was published first, and it became a wild success financially, and then it won a Pulitzer Prize. So her publisher told her, we don't want to compete with The Grapes of Wrath, and they didn't publish her book, and it was only published in 2005. I liked The Grapes of Wrath a great deal. I read it this year. I think Whose Names Are Unknown is better. It has a more profound empathy for its characters, and I think you can really see how Sonora Babb's lived experience and the similarities, that things that she had lived through and talked to people who had survived similar things. It really comes through. It is a very empathetic book. It is also a lot more subtle. The Grapes of Wrath can be a bit heavy-handed with its imagery and symbolism, and this one feels a lot more down to earth and grounded, and I just think it's absolutely fantastic. And I will never talk about The Grapes of Wrath without bringing up Whose Names Are Unknown. I did a whole video about the situation, about The Grapes of Wrath, and I included a lot about this situation. I'll include a link to that video in the description box down below if you would like a lot more about it. Suffice to say, this is just me, once again, calling you to the work of Sonora Babb and Whose Names Are Unknown. This is actually not even the original copy of this book that I purchased. A friend came over to visit and was having dinner with Joel and I, and we were talking about books, and I brought up Whose Names Are Unknown, and she said she wanted to read it. I gave her my copy right then and there, and I knew that my local used bookstore had copies that I could easily replace it. So yeah, this is a book that I am definitely encouraging people to discover because I loved it, and I think it's great. Hopefully you would as well. Then there is Boulder by Eva Baltazar, translated by Julia Sanchez. Now, this was shortlisted for the Booker International Prize. So, in a way, it's a little unfair to say that this is something that more people need to discover because there's a tool for discovery kind of inherently built in, just like with Wandering Souls and the Bandit Queens. However, I do feel like there hasn't been a whole lot of conversation about this book since the International Booker Prize was announced, just like with Wandering Souls and the Bandit Queens. And this is me sort of reminding you about Boulder and saying this is a really interesting novella. Because it's a novella, it's short enough that you could kind of cram it into your reading. It is a story about a woman who lives a very independent life, like a very determinedly independent life. She meets a woman that she loves. She's working on a sailing vessel, going from port to port in South America. And eventually, the woman that she is in love with gets a job in Iceland. and she decides to upend her life by following the woman that she loves to Iceland. So from there, the book is about the compromises that you make in order to share your life with another person, and how difficult it can be if you are an inherently independent person who prefers isolation. And the book blurb talks about the inciting incident as if it's the girlfriend then deciding that she wants to have a child. And our protagonist, who's nicknamed Boulder, has never wanted to be a mother, but she sort of goes along with it because she wants her partner to be happy. And it's about the compromises that she has made and the difficulties of this relationship. It's short, it's powerful, it really packs a punch. I would definitely recommend it to you. Then we have Ducks 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton. This is a graphic memoir that the people who I know who have read it all love it, but I haven't seen a whole lot of discussion about it. I'm a fan of graphic memoirs. I think the difficulty with graphic novels and graphic memoirs is that a lot of the time people are reluctant to add to the page count in order to really allow a story to develop and a tone to develop. And Kate Beaton very cleverly takes her time, and yet it reads very quickly. She allows the story to develop. She does not try to gloss over anything to save page count. She uses the illustrations and the situations that she portrays to create a sense of mood that propels you through the book. And it's about her difficulties working in the oil sands of Alberta for 2 years. She grew up in a place that was economically depressed. So often when people graduated from high school, they would go seek their fortune elsewhere, and then maybe they would come back once they had established themselves and maybe were ready to start a family. And a lot of people went to the oil sands in Alberta. It was not a very safe place for women to work, but she decided to try her hands there. And there are a lot of difficult things, trigger warnings that she experiences when she gets to the oil sands, but her perspective is really powerful. I keep saying the word powerful, but that's why I like these books so much. They are powerful, and Ducks is definitely up in that realm. I am very hopeful that more people will discover it and read it and share it, because I think it is a story that is told in such a beautiful, resonant way and even-handed way that more people would benefit from reading it and discovering it, for sure. The final book I want to talk about in this video is A Council of Dolls by Mona Susan Power. I read this book in November. I wanted to read it in November because Native American History Month, and I sort of timed it along with Thanksgiving, because I felt like with Thanksgiving having a sort of complicated colonial history, I really wanted to read something that reflected Indigenous stories in it. And it actually really reminded me of The Yield. And this is me once again saying, if you liked The Yield, you would probably like A Council of Dolls as well. I will say A Council of Dolls is not quite on the level of The Yield. I think The Yield's an absolutely fantastic book. And there is a difference, because The Yield deals with Indigenous life in Australia, and A Council of Dolls deals with Indigenous life in the United States. But I feel like there are more similarities than there are differences in the book, because it is about how culture, identity, and language was taken from Indigenous people here in the United States, which is also something that happened in Australia, and which is reflected in The Yield. And it's a very powerful story about 3 generations of women. There are sort of mystical aspects to it, because each of them has a doll that has a sort of mystical power and is a little bit protective of the women in their lives. And I admit I don't fully understand a lot of how that works and functions in it, but the story itself is so well told that I am here telling you that this is a book that would be well worth your time, for sure. It's beautiful, it's powerful, it is sad in a lot of ways, because this is something that really happened to a lot of people. It deals with the Indian schools. If you're unfamiliar, children were taken from their families and sent to Indian schools so their culture could be taken from them, essentially, and they could be educated to live as if they were white people, and yet they could never be treated as well as white people would in society. They could never attain that level of social status. But They were punished if they used their language. They were punished if they honored any of their customs or rituals. They were basically stripped of their identities, and these schools tried to rebuild them. And it's about the traumas and difficulties that these people had, and the lingering traumas that it has had in subsequent generations. A very powerful book. But anyway, those are the books I read in 2023 that I am really hoping more people will discover and love as much as I did. If you have books that you would add to the list, let me know in the comment section down below. Or if you have thoughts about any of the books I've talked about, or recommendations based on any of the books that I have discussed, let me know that in the comment section down below as well. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.